Intellectual property is not an American invention, but it is uniquely protected in America. The notion of governmentally granted patents is as old as the U.S. Constitution. As Bob points out in his book, the very first patent granted under the very first U.S. Patent Act was signed by George Washington, and the examiner of that particular patent was Thomas Jefferson. So the idea of patented intellectual property is as old as the nation itself. We will examine today the functions that patents serve. Some say that patents are really designed to give the duly qualified inventor the right to exploit that invention for commercial gain. Some say patents are intended to make sure that all of the aspects of a patented invention are fully disclosed so that everyone can understand it and improve upon it or advance it through innovation. Now, when we scheduled this debate several months ago, we knew that patents and patent debates were an ongoing topic, but I think we were all a little surprised at how hot they've become recently. Recently being as recently as last week, when Google paid more than $12 billion for Motorola Mobility, largely for its patent portfolio. Forbes has done an analysis of that and figured out that Google paid about $750,000 per patent to make that acquisition. So the question being openly debated today is with respect to software: do patents encourage innovation or do they stifle it? Arguing for the motion is entrepreneur and author Bob Zeidman. Arguing against the motion is University of California at Berkeley Professor Edward Lee. I'm going to ask them both to come to the stage. I'll take my seat as the moderator and we'll begin. Now, before we do that, let's have the show of hands now. So everyone who is in favor of the motion, software encourages innovation, please raise your hands. Keep them raised so we can get a count. Please keep them up. All right, good. Now, if you're against the motion, please raise your hands. All right, we're all set. Thanks, everyone. And as someone asked, if you're here to just enjoy the lunch, you don't have to raise your hand. Just enjoy your lunch, enjoy the debate, and I'll ask Bob and Edward to come up to the stage now. Gentlemen, please come on up. All right, so I'm going to introduce each of our participants in turn, and as is customary in a debate, the participant arguing for the motion goes first. So I'll introduce Bob Zeidman, who is president and founder of Zeidman Consulting, which is a leading Silicon Valley contract R&D firm specializing in intellectual property disputes. He has been an entrepreneur, a designer of risk-based systems, network equipment, and other complex systems. His clients include Apple, Zynga, Facebook, Cisco, Cadence, and Symantec. He's been a witness and consultant on patent cases involving billions of dollars of disputed IP. He's the president and founder of Software Analysis and Forensic Engineering Corporation and the author of the new book, The Software IP Detective's Handbook. Bob holds multiple patents himself. His undergraduate degrees are from Cornell, a BA in physics and a BS in electrical engineering, and he holds a master's degree in electrical engineering from Stanford. Bob, welcome, and you have the first 7 minutes. Take it away.
Okay, thank you, John. First, I'd like to thank the Computer History Museum for doing this, for putting on this debate. It's, as John mentioned, it's a very appropriate time. It's a very important issue. I'd like to thank Carol Stiglick for really her perseverance and patience in organizing this. It wasn't an easy thing to put together. And John for also encouraging this event and for moderating. And to Professor Lee, who is a worthy adversary, and I appreciate his taking up the challenge here. And to the audience for coming to hear both sides of what I think is an important issue, a very relevant issue, and obviously a very pertinent issue right now. So I want to explain first, I'm a little bit nervous up here. I don't always give talks to pretty large audiences. So I brought some things with me to help me feel a little more comfortable. I brought some courage. Okay, this is my courage bear. Makes me feel a little better about being up here. I brought happiness, my happiness bear, right? So it makes me feel a little better. I'm a little nervous, and these things just help me. And I brought a big heart to show love. I want to feel love. I hope everybody has love for me out there in the audience, even if you disagree with me. Well, the point I'm trying to make here is that this is not love. You know, these are stuffed animals. In fact, they're really just stuffed cloth. But they represent some of the things that we hold most dear: happiness, love, courage. It's the intangible things that we hold most dear to ourselves. And intellectual property falls into that category. I've had people tell me that there's no such thing as intellectual property, that intellectual property is intangible, it's not like real property that you can protect from theft, and it doesn't really exist. But what I would say is that intellectual property represents some of the best characteristics of humans: our ability to think, our ability to create new things, our ability to improve the world, and our ability to invent. In fact, these are the kind of things that nations go to war over, that people protect more than anything: freedom, liberty, justice, love, happiness, much more than physical property, which can be replaced. And in fact, novelists, filmmakers, and poets would be out of jobs if these things weren't so important to us. So the first notion I want to get over is that there's no such thing as intellectual property, because in fact I think that intellectual property, like all these intangibles that these things represent, are very important to us. Just like this patent here is not a piece of paper. I mean, obviously this is a piece of paper, but what it represents is the creativity and invention of people like us in this room and people throughout Silicon Valley. I'd also like to point out that not everybody realizes that patent protection is guaranteed in the Constitution of the United States. It wasn't even an afterthought. It wasn't as important as the Bill of Rights are, which came along after the Constitution was ratified. Smack dab in the middle of the Constitution is protection for intellectual property for inventors and authors. So the Founding Fathers thought that intellectual property was pretty important also. I also want to point out that patents have always covered two kinds of things: apparatuses, which are devices like your automobile engine, and also methods. So a method is a way of producing something. It's not a physical thing. And patents, since the very beginning, have covered methods. So for example, I have a patent claim from patent number 1,707,463 that was filed in 1927, long before software, by Henry Ford. The claim reads: "The method of forming a fan, consisting of welding together sheet metal blanks to form the blades and the hub section, then welding a ring to the hub member to form a combined pulley and hub member, and then welding the fan member to the hub member to form a complete unitary fan and pulley structure." The important thing there is that there is nothing about a device that does this. This is a patent for a method. Methods have always been recognized as patentable. So I would like to say that software is about as pure a method as you can possibly get. Right? Software is a method for controlling something. And if a method for building an automobile is patentable, then why isn't the software that controls the machinery that performs that method equally patentable? Now, the other thing I'd like to ask here is, how many people in the audience are programmers or have written code at some point in their careers or in their lives? Okay, a lot of people. Let me ask you, keep your hands up, if you can keep your hands up for a minute. Now, of those people, I'd like to ask you, who thinks that anyone off the street could do what you do? Put your hand down if you believe that's true. That you could say that what you've done is just not very creative, not very innovative, and that it didn't really require a 4-year education or 5 years of training. I see some of you are putting your hands down. How many people have worked with programmers who don't think they're as creative as you are? You've worked with programmers who just don't think they write software as well as you do. Okay. Well, at least what I'd like to argue is that software is very creative. It's one of the most creative endeavors we have. And I think that sometimes programmers happen to underestimate the amount of effort that goes into it. It's not simply that anybody off the street, out of high school with no background in programming can do this. Finally, I'd like to say that the first software patent was issued in 1968. I think it's hard to say that innovation has been stifled since 1968. We've seen growth of Microsoft, Oracle, SAP, Symantec, Activision, CA, Electronic Arts, Adobe, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Red Hat, Intuit. That's just a tiny part of the list. And we've seen a huge and growing open source community of developers. The open source community has been growing like crazy. The amount of open source software is gigantic and growing daily. And patents have not stopped that. In fact, I would argue it spurred that, because people who don't want to patent their work, who do want to offer it for free, still have that option under the current system. So in my opinion, patents protect innovation, they spur innovation, and that software patents spur software innovation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Bob, very much. And now we're going to hear the argument against the motion, at least the opening argument, from Edward Lee, who is the Robert S. Pepper Distinguished Professor, former chair of the Electrical Engineering and Computer Sciences Department at UC Berkeley. His research interests center on design, modeling, and simulation of embedded real-time computational systems. He is a director of CHESS, the Berkeley Center for Hybrid and Embedded Software Systems, and is the director of the Berkeley Ptolemy Project. He's the author of 5 books and numerous papers. From 1979 to 1982, he was a member of the technical staff at Bell Telephone Laboratories in the Advanced Data Communications Laboratory. He's a fellow of the IEEE and the winner of the 1997 Frederick Emmons Terman Award for Engineering Education. His bachelor's degree is from Yale, his master's from MIT, and his PhD from UC Berkeley. Edward, you have the argument against the motion. Welcome, and take it away.
Thank you, John. I'd like to echo Bob's thanks, but add to that thanks to Bob. It was his idea originally to have this debate. I still don't know how you managed to talk me into this, but here I am. All right. So today, if you are successful with a software product, a software-based product, unfortunately, you're quite likely to be sued. If you're not successful, you're not so likely to be sued. But the current situation is that success, in particular measured as bringing in money, tends to draw fire. Now, patents are imperfect, like any socially constructed mechanism that we have. I don't think anyone would deny that. But what I'd like to argue is that software patents are egregiously imperfect, and that they actually, in many ways, distort the system. I think there's plenty of evidence for this. The fact that a disproportionate amount of the patent litigation involves software patents in much greater proportion than the software patents themselves seems to be indicative of a problem, because litigation is a dispute mechanism, and if these, you know, if a property law is working really well, you don't get disputes. You get resolution without having to go to court. And I think that the tremendous amount of litigation around this is certainly indicative that there's a problem. The roots of the problem may be very fundamental in the technology. I think that some software patents are really quite abstract. They're dealing fundamentally with an abstract technology. And I think that one of the consequences of the abstractness of these patents is that it's very difficult to define the boundaries of the concepts that are embodied in these patents. And if you can't define the boundaries, you inevitably get disputes. Another property that many software patents have is that they're very complex. It's possible to build an enormous amount of complexity into software, and if there's innovation in that complexity, it's natural to want to patent it. And as a consequence, the complexity of the patents actually has several side effects. It makes it very difficult, for example, to avoid infringement by reading the patent literature, because the cost to you of reading through large numbers of rather complex patents is enormous. Moreover, even if you do take the effort to read through all of this patent literature, you find in many cases with these patents, you can get two perfectly well-meaning experts on the subject who will disagree about whether your product actually infringes on the patent. So the problem there is that I think the boundaries of the concepts described in the patent, for software patents in particular, tends to be rather difficult to define. So patents are based on property law. And in property law, you know, the property that your house is built on, for example, there are pretty well-established ways of defining the boundaries and of giving notice to people of what those boundaries are. You know, if somebody climbs over your fence, everyone would pretty much agree that they are in fact violating your your property rights. But unfortunately, we don't really have that situation with software patents often. So let me give you an analogy. So imagine yourself as an explorer. You love to explore. You like to you like to make it specific. You're really interested in culture and architecture, and you like to explore cities and try to understand the culture of the city through its architecture. So you drive to a new city and you start wandering through the streets, driving your BMW through these streets, you know, noticing the peculiarities of how neighborhoods are put together and buildings are put together and so on. But you don't notice that every once in a while in these neighborhoods there's these little graffiti on the walls, maybe, that you're passing, and in fact what's going on is that there are gangs that are in fact claiming that these are actually not public streets, that these things that appear to be public streets are actually private, and these gangs actually control them. So you get confronted by one of these gangs, and of course you're quick thinking, so you call the police, and the police show up and they order you to turn over your car to the gang, and you end up walking home. Unfortunately, this scenario happens to innovators in software all too commonly. And I think that this is a problem that we as a culture really need to address. So I would like to emphasize that I'm not arguing that this is a problem with patents per se. There are industries in which patents work very well. In the chemical and pharmaceutical industries, I think they work very well. And I think one of the reasons is that it's pretty easy to get experts to agree on the structure of a molecule. So if you have a patent that is based on the structure of the molecule, you're not going to have the kind of disputes that you have because the boundaries are much better defined. So do patents encourage innovation? Well, in my view, they don't. They don't encourage innovation. I think what they encourage is patenting, which is a rather different thing. I would like to cite some work by two very well-respected Boston University law school professors, Besson and Mura. They wrote a wonderful book that's a very entertaining read called Patent Failure. But they show through their research, years of research, that when you exclude the chemical and the pharmaceutical industries, that patents actually tax research and development at least 12.5%. They make rather conservative arguments, so they're trying to put a lower floor on the tax to research and development. So that means that for every dollar you spend on research and development, 12.5 cents is actually sunk into the patent system as a tax. So if you tax research and development, of course, that is decreasing the resources that go into research and development, which all by itself should have the side effect of reducing innovation on the assumption that investment in research and development leads to innovation. Now, I'm supposed to be arguing that patents do not encourage innovation, but they actually do encourage innovation in certain dimensions. So Bob, for example, I think has done a lot of very innovative work in technology for detecting patent infringement. I think that without the patent system, he would probably not be incentivized to do that. So that's, I think, a good example of where it does, in fact, encourage innovation.
All right.
So thank you very much, and I guess I'm out of time.
All right. Thanks, Edward. All right, now
and
we're
those
getting
tools
into the
are
debate.
patented.
Now, okay, so now the gloves are off. Thank you, Edward. Just before I ask the first question to follow up, let me just give you a tally of the votes that were taken. So at the time the vote was taken, there were 175 people in the room. 60 people are for the motion, 89 are against the motion, 26 undecided, didn't vote, or were eating their sandwiches at the time and occupied. So that tells you where we start at the beginning of the debate. Bob, let's go to you. One of the points that you made and you make in your book is that, and it's a little discussed area of patent law, really, but one of the principles is that new processes and methods be made public. That innovators otherwise would just keep everything secret, and innovations that could be built upon would never be disclosed as they are through the patent process. Why do you think that is a good thing with software in particular?
Well, I think it's a good thing in general. It's hard to isolate software, but I think that any creative event, before the patent system in, years and years ago, people are probably familiar with some invention. For example, there was the Greek clock, the name I can never pronounce, that, the people who created that never wrote down how that worked. Inventions were held very dearly because it meant a lot. It meant a lot of revenue. People could build businesses. They didn't want to give that away. Patenting allowed people to say, okay, we're going to tell you how this works so that you can improve on it, you can understand it, and in return the government is giving you a monopoly on it, saying nobody can use that invention. Now the example of software patents that I can use, I think there's lots of examples, but it's hard to pick one in particular. But I know from personal experience, so Professor Lee talked about my tools for detecting copyright infringement. I have to present these in court, and it's very difficult to go into court and say, I found that these programs are copied, but I'm not going to tell you how I found that. It doesn't win many court cases. So I had to tell people, here's the algorithms, here's how it worked, and the only way for me to do that and not get other people, and other people have tried to take those algorithms once I've explained them, the only way to get protection was through a patent. So the only way that I could present these ideas to people in court and have the tool be successful was to make them public, and the only way to do that and get protection was through a patent.
Okay. How about that, Edward? What do you think about, wouldn't we be worse off if some of these methods that are introduced and these software breakthroughs were never made public as they should be through the patent system?
Well, speaking as an academic who often puts, in fact, fairly consistently puts our work in open source form, I know from experience that disclosing your techniques does not necessarily mean that people learn them. So I do believe, I mean, it's certainly one of the goals of the patent system is to get inventors to disclose their techniques. Obviously, one advantage to that is that innovative techniques don't die with the inventor. And I think that that is, in fact, quite valuable. I think there are many other ways to accomplish that same goal. I would like to argue, however, that I don't think this really has anything to do with encouraging innovation. And in fact, I think that if you want to encourage innovation, we should actually be investing in education, not in patents. And I think that this particular property of patents, the fact that you must disclose inventions in an enabling way, is actually an educational goal. And I think that that goal is certainly a laudable part of the patent system, but there are many other ways of accomplishing that same goal.
Great. All right, Bob, let's go to another part of your opening statement where you discussed, you made the distinction between devices and methods. There is an argument, and Edward started to make it, that really what we're talking about in the case of software is something that is highly abstract. It's very diffuse. The boundaries are difficult to define. True innovation is difficult to define as opposed to something that is derivative, let's say, of somebody else's work. How does the patent system clarify all that and bring about innovation?
So that's a really good question, because my answer is it doesn't. And I'd like to say that of the arguments that I've heard from people who disagree that software patents spur innovation, the one argument that I feel is their best argument is that really these are abstract concepts, and abstract concepts are not supposed to be patentable. Now, what happens is ever since software, the courts have really been struggling with this issue, and I don't think that it's resolved. I think that it's an ongoing process because in the 1970s they thought it was resolved, but of course software is changing so quickly, I'm not sure it'll ever be resolved. But I don't think that's a reason to discard the patent system. What happens is the examiners at the patent office go through a rigorous process. I think they could go through a much better process. I think the patent office doesn't use technology to its own advantage. I think there's a lot of things that the examiners don't understand, all the software issues, and these are all problems that the Patent Office needs to become more efficient. And if they become more efficient, software patents will get better. In other words, there will be fewer bad software patents, fewer patents that either don't protect anything or protect some broad mathematical concept that shouldn't have been protected in the first place. So it's definitely a problem, but I think it's getting better, but it's not a reason to throw out the entire system. It's a reason to make the system more efficient. And as someone who's worked as an expert witness in patent litigation, I can tell you there's a lot of bad patents out there, not just software patents, but a lot of bad patents. And that's a problem. So if we continue to make it more efficient, we won't have to have as much litigation. And then in litigation, hopefully if we make that system more efficient, the litigation will end pretty quickly and less expensively. But again, I think that's a reason for making the system more efficient, not a reason for getting rid of software patents.
So first of all, I'd like to argue that I actually don't support getting rid of software patents and certainly don't support getting rid of the patent system. My argument is that one of the criteria for patents should be that boundaries be well defined. But to address the original question, I think one of the challenges with software patents is that often the patents that you see are building on very new technology. The technology emerges like cloud computing or graphical user interfaces or web technology, and people get ideas for things that they can do with it, and they get patents on these things. And what happens is that shortly thereafter, these ideas actually become rather obvious to anyone who uses that technology. Now, that doesn't actually invalidate patents. When ideas become obvious in retrospect, that does not in any way invalidate the patent. But it does have one consequence which has a profound societal cost, which is it leads to inadvertent infringement. That if you build a piece of software that just does the obvious thing with web technology, you are probably infringing some patents out there. And if you're therefore successful with that product, you're going to end up getting approached. Now, either to pay royalties or end up in a lawsuit. I think there's an enormous societal cost to that, and that in effect it really it amounts to an ability that we've opened up in the patent system to patent future inventions, because you in effect create a rather broadly worded, fairly abstract patent based on a technology, and the ideas that you describe in this patent will emerge without your help because they will be obvious as soon as the technology becomes familiar to the developers. So you haven't really contributed anything to the overall progress in the field, but you nonetheless reap benefits from having been kind of the first one to write it down.
Can I make a comment about
Sure.
that? So Professor Lee's made a couple times made a statement that I think is absolutely true, that your patent, if you are software developers, you won't be, nobody will sue you for patent infringement or come to you to license your patents unless you're successful. And I think that's really critical. I hear a lot of arguments, Professor Lee hasn't directly made this argument, but I hear a lot of arguments that it stifles the little guy. But the fact is the little guy is in the best position ever, because if you're not making money or you're making $1 million a year or you're just getting your company off the ground, nobody's going to sue you because you don't have anything that's worth suing for. They sue you once you're a $100 million company, once you're a $1 billion company. And I shouldn't say sue, they license. You don't have to sue somebody, you can license your patents. My advice to companies is get your patents early so that when a company comes to you and says you're infringing on our patent, if you are, you can say, well, you're infringing on our patent. And then you have a nice settlement that doesn't put anybody out of business. Everybody shares their ideas, in fact. But as a little guy, there's no real threat of being sued for infringement.
So can I, since Bob got a rebuttal there,
This
can
is
I-
great. A
May I
Sir
have
rebuttal.
So I'd like to address this issue of the little guy, because I think that the argument is often made that that the patent system is very helpful to individual innovators who are not necessarily tied to large companies. First of all, I think that the numbers don't actually bear that up. I think that if you look at it, it's really a hard position to defend. But one thing that I think we have seen happen with little guys is that, in effect, it's easier, the patent system has created a way for them to effectively reap some benefits from their invention. But the story all too often unfolds as follows. An An inventor comes up with an idea, writes a patent, but never brings the product to market, doesn't invest in the development process to commercialize the product. Perhaps he doesn't have the means to. He's a little guy, right? Maybe it would cost quite a bit to do it. So what he does instead is he sells that patent to one of these non-practicing entities which collect patent portfolios, and they sit on it. They just wait. They don't, nominally it's disclosed, right? So the world knows about it, but us academics know that no matter how much disclosure you do, the world does not in fact know about it. What happens instead is that someone independently develops the same idea and does invest in commercializing it and bringing it to market and makes it successful. And then this non-practicing entity, which has collected patent portfolios, says, aha, and goes after them and makes a ton of money. Now, this is completely legal, totally allowed by our system. Is this a good thing for our culture? I'm not so sure, right? The little guy's invention had zero impact on technology development in that story. Zero, right? Because the idea got developed anyway by someone independently later who then actually did invest in bringing it to market.
I'm glad you got into that whole subject. That was going to be the next one that I was going to ask about. You call them the NPEs, as they're known, also lovingly known as patent trolls. Certainly, NPR called all of our attention to that publicly through its piece a couple of weeks ago on When Patents Attack, letting us all know that Marshall, Texas had sort of magically become the patent capital of the world. Who knew that that was actually going to happen? So Bob, why don't you take that on? Patent trolls are people who collect but don't exploit patents until they're litigating against someone else is certainly in the forefront of the public mind right now. How would you take that on as the encourage innovation advocate?
Sure. So somehow I thought you were going to ask me that question. But I'd like to bring attention to an even worse problem in society today, and that is the fruit and produce trolls. Have people seen them on the corners? They don't produce fruit. They don't grow their own fruit. They don't grow their own produce. Places like Lucky's, I don't know, what are the supermarkets these days? The supermarkets, right? They take fruit and produce that were grown by real farmers, and instead they just buy it up. All they're doing is spending their money to buy it up and distribute it to people that must have it and must pay a price for it. I think that's worse than patent trolls. Because I think my point is that there's a lot of things that people don't read about patent, what I like to call patent licensors. And I know people are going to disagree with me about this, but here are my, not only some statistics, but my personal anecdotes. First of all, everybody's heard about the lawsuits, the patent lawsuits in the paper lately, right? All of them. Google, Microsoft, Oracle, SAP, right? Motorola. Have you heard of any company that's an NPE? No, of course not. Because they account for less than 2% of all the patent litigation in the country. Less than 2%. You hear about the big one, you know, the big one that gets millions of dollars, but you don't hear about any others because there are very few others. The other thing is that there's a belief that somehow in the Eastern District of Texas that, you know, if you want to sue somebody for patent infringement, you just go there. And you say, I want to sue a big company, and they hand you a lot of money. It turns out that patent suits in Texas, only in the Eastern District of Texas, only win 40% of the time, which means more often than not, they lose. Now, if I have enough time for one quick anecdote, this is a personal thing. I had, and this is what's not understood about patent licensors, and this story is more common than people realize. I had a business, a small business, it was just me. I invented some software. Somebody convinced me to patent it. I didn't think it was that unique. Can I take a few more seconds?
One more minute.
And I sold it to, I started selling it to some EDA companies in Silicon Valley. And they needed this little piece of software to sell multi-million-dollar machines, because without it, it enabled them in the telecom industry to sell their machines. And this was a great little business for years. I mean, I didn't get rich off it, but I made a significant income. And one day, one of the big companies that was the majority purchaser, the majority customer, came to me and said, we're going to do our own, we don't need yours anymore. And I was lucky that somebody had convinced me to create it, to get a patent on it, and I said, well, I've got a patent, you can't do that. They said to me, we're going to do it anyway. And so what I did, my revenue, my personal revenue dropped to zero. And I went to some attorneys and I said, I want to get a license from this company. I want to stop them from doing this. And they said it'll be a $100,000 retainer just to retain us. And you should prepare to spend $1 million to go to litigation, which I couldn't do. So I went to some of these patent licensors, and I said, are you interested in my patent? They said, of course. They paid me the money that I would have made for the next few years off this product. And now I don't know what happened after that, but I have this vision of them sitting at a table, and it's not me and nobody behind me. It's them with lots of money and investors and lawyers saying, you know what? You're practicing something that doesn't belong to you, and now you've got to pay for it. So I think people don't see that aspect of the patent licensors, NPEs, or patent trolls.
I'm going to go to another question here.
Wait,
This is from the audience.
Can I make a response to that?
Sure.
Okay. Thanks, John.
I'm a friendly moderator.
I actually agree with Bob that, in fact, there is a useful function that is performed. It has to do with essentially creating liquidity in markets. It's similar to what arbitrage people do in the finance markets. And, you could see them as simply, leeches sucking blood from the system. But the fact is that they do actually have a potentially beneficial effect on the system. But there's something a little bit cynical about all of this Marshall, Texas stuff. There's a lot of reasons why these suits get filed in Marshall, Texas, but one of the interesting ones is that it turns out that part of East Texas has among the lowest graduation rates from high school and college in the country. And it also turns out that, especially with regard to complex software patents, uneducated juries are much less likely to invalidate the patent than educated juries. And I find that a rather sort of cynical approach to gaming the system.
Very quick comment.
Sure.
It turns out that the Northern District of California, where we live, the heart of Silicon Valley, plaintiffs are awarded in patent litigation suits much higher than Marshall, Texas, even though that's not understood. But Stanford University just did some research. You can get it from me later. The Stanford Intellectual Property Clearinghouse that showed that Northern California, where people are pretty well educated, is actually much higher than Marshall, Texas.
Interesting. All right, we have some great questions from the audience as well. I'm not going to be able to get to them all, but let me ask a few. The first is for you, Edward. Is not the principle of an incentive mechanism integral to intellectual property in general? And if so, why would software patents be excluded from that principle?
In my opinion, the purpose of patents should be primarily not to incentivize innovation, but rather to maximize the impact of that innovation. So of course, if you maximize the impact of innovation, that impact could be measured in many ways. It depends on what you do. I'm an academic. I release open source software. The impact that I have is getting it used. It's not a financial remuneration, but in a lot of other products, you measure impact with financial gain. So if you have impact, you do in fact benefit financially from what you do. I think that if you look at the pharmaceutical industry, patents are very effective in maximizing the impact of innovation. Because in the pharmaceutical industry, it can cost upwards of $100 million to bring a drug to market. And without intellectual property protection, your likelihood of being able to reap rewards on that investment is near zero. And so people simply don't bring drugs to market if they have been unsuccessful in getting a patent, or if the drug is maybe something that's open source, right? It may be a herbal medicine of some sort that has been known to the Chinese for 2,000 years, but you can't invest $100 million to bring that to market because you're not going to be able to recoup that investment. So I think if we refocus the purpose of the patent system on maximizing the impact of innovation, then we will get side benefits of enhancing innovation in productive ways. Right now, I think we tend to encourage innovation in unproductive ways, such as this story of people who make patents and never bring the products to market and simply effectively tax the system.
Bob, the incentive mechanism. I'm going to give you a chance to rebut that. Being integral to intellectual property and software being in that same category?
Yeah, I think that really I think there shouldn't be a differentiation between other kinds of patents and software patents. I think if you agree that other kinds of patents spur innovation, which I do and a lot of people do, and Professor Lee does in some cases, then I think software is the same way. You know, one thing that surprised me here a bit, especially as somebody who manages software engineers and has been a software engineer for many, many years, is when I asked that question in the beginning about could anybody do it, you know, put your hand down, I really didn't expect so many people to put their hand down. I think people are being falsely modest because I know as a manager I have plenty of employees who come up to me and tell me, hey, that guy can't write code as well as I can. You know, you should give the project to me, or that guy screwed up. And I think it is a really creative endeavor, and I think that software patents protect that. I think we just have a tendency to underestimate the effort that goes into creating the software, thinking that, well, somebody would do that anyway. And in fact, with that story I gave about my contact with a NPE, patent licensor, you know, I had to be convinced for about a year, almost exactly a year. You've got 1 year after you present your idea publicly, you can still patent it within that year. And people came up to me, this is before I was involved in patents, and they said, you need to protect this. And I said, anybody could do it. But you know what? The company that ended up purchasing the software from me had tried during that year. I made a public presentation to them. They said, we're going to go away and do this. And I thought, well, they could do it. It's pretty easy. I just told them how. And a year later, they came back to me and said, we want to buy that product from you because we couldn't do it. So I think the thing is I think as programmers and computer scientists, we underestimate what we're doing, maybe because so many people are doing it. Or maybe it's because it's not a physical thing you can hold in your hand. But I think it's just as creative, just as innovative, and for that reason, we need the protection of software patents.
Response?
Again, I want to emphasize that it's not software patents across the board that I think are the problem. I think the problem is when you have patents that do not have clear boundaries. And I think that the situation that we're currently facing with software patents is that is more often the case. I think that by their very nature, patents in areas that are more concrete the boundaries are more easily recognized by people than in the case of software patents. And I think that is what the system is struggling with, is when we have unclear boundaries, we end up wasting an enormous amount of societal resources on resolving disputes over those boundaries.
There are a number of questions here I'm going to try to distill down into one that I think I would just call protecting U.S. innovation against international competition or international piracy. How is it possible that we would protect technology developed here against that threat without the patent process? Edward, I think I'll call on you first.
Well, I'm kind of a devotee of Friedman's flat world view, and so it's hard for me to really sort of take the stand of worrying that much about the national borders here. I think that our goal in any community should be to maximize the productiveness of our community, and I think that we in the United States have enormous advantages over the rest of the world. We have the widely acknowledged world's best educational system. It draws, in fact, some of the best minds of the world to the United States, and these people then often stay and contribute to the vitality of our enterprise here. And to me, this is a trans-border effect that happens. We bring great minds to the United States. They build Silicon Valley. I'm not a devotee of a kind of protectionism that we somehow have to use our laws to protect against those invaders from the East. I think that we should protect ourselves by innovating.
Bob.
So I think it's a really good question. And I also believe in free trade and open markets completely internationally. The problem we have is you can call them false restrictions, but we have the restrictions of governments. And the fact is there are boundaries that are controlled by different sets of laws. And that's the problem that we need to fight against. And in that case, let me tell you that the three countries that are worst at protecting intellectual property are China, Russia, and Pakistan. First of all, you'll see that none of those countries are considered innovative. So if not having software patents, I know that's not your position, but not having software patents spurs innovation, those certainly aren't good examples. But also, they are nations that don't respect intellectual property rights at all. And what's happened now is that if everything were equal, the protections were equal, and commerce was equal, I'd say that Professor Lee would have a stronger point. But right now, technology has allowed the transfer of software and other technology virtually instantaneously all over the world without being able to stop it. When security companies like RSA are getting broken into, then there's not much hope for any of us. So this software is being spread all over the world, and if we don't have laws that strongly protect our intellectual property, then we're going to see what I've come into on a case-by-case basis. My company has seen cases in China where China gets hold of software, starts selling it cheaply. It didn't develop it. In some cases it did develop it, but it developed it under contract and just starts selling it. We can't, even now, we cannot protect that software in China or outside our borders, but at the very least, we can, and I've been successful in being part of stopping that software, that technology from coming in. I also want to point out that, of course, there's going to be lawsuits that are unjustified, that are unethical. I'm not talking about that. There's a lot of legitimate reasons for keeping software out or protecting software that's here, that's been developed here, because those other countries don't respect intellectual property.
So, John, can I just make a quick...
Sure.
It's actually not so much a rebuttal as an agreement. When I was traveling in China recently, I found all these Starsbuck coffee shops. Okay, I think one of the unfortunate things about the situation that Bob is exactly right, is very real, is that it actually argues against getting patents on your software, because if you patent your software, you are required to disclose it. And you can get worldwide patents, and the fact is there are big economies in the world and rapidly growing economies that are simply not going to respect those rights. So you might be better off, in fact, avoiding the patent system altogether and relying on trade secrets. That would be an unfortunate consequence, but I'm afraid that is the situation we're in right now.
It's a really quick comment. Is that right? So, I mean, we're not disagreeing too much here, and I think that I actually talk to people about protecting through trade secrets, which are different than patents, but of course that keeps things secret. However, for example, my company and I personally get patents in the US because fortunately, not only do we have the best protection here, we still have the best market for software. So as a small inventor, I'm willing to say, okay, China can steal my code because they might steal it anyway. But I know if they try to import that code here, I know the US government will help me and my lawyers will help me protect it.
All right, so one final question, and then you both get 2 minutes to sum up. Can either of you describe what you think would be a better form of intellectual property protection for software than patents or copyrights or some structure like that? Bob, I'm going to give you the first chance to answer that.
So probably not surprisingly, I think that the system we have is basically a really good system that's worked for a long time. I do say, like I said earlier, though, there's a lot of inefficiencies. I talk a lot to colleagues, to attorneys I work with, to entrepreneurs and business people, that the system, particularly for software, doesn't work as well as it should. There are foolish litigations. I can't tell you how many times lawyers come to me from some major companies, by the way. This is always major companies. I won't name them. But they come to me with, here's a list, a pile of patents we want to assert against this other company. And I'll go through them and say, okay, I was doing that 10 years ago. I've got a book that describes this one. Not just software, but hardware too. I think the patent system needs to be improved. You know, the patent examiners need to be better trained. The system needs to use technology much better than it does. I had a patent that had to do with tasks in an operating system, and the examiner searched for the word tasks, and anything that had the word task in it came back as prior art. And I spent several years and several $1,000s arguing, okay, this isn't the same kind of task. And the examiner said, well, it says task. So I think that really the technology needs to be improved. We need to I have no problem with stricter standards on expert witnesses. I talk about that in my book. That's very a little bit controversial coming from an expert witness, but better trained examiners, better trained judges would be terrific. I think there's lots of things we can do to improve the system, but the basic system works.
Edward.
So I agree that the system needs improvement, but I'm afraid that I'm not optimistic about that. I think that if you look at software patents in particular, there were a bunch of court decisions in the 80s and early 90s that unleashed the patent system to make it much more accessible for what we now call software patents. And you know, the 80s and early 90s were quite some time ago, and the Patent Office has, in fact, definitely stepped up their hiring of computer scientists to do examination and so on. And there's been a considerable amount of time for the community and the courts to learn how to make the system work well. So if there was, in fact, a learning process as the system adapted to the new technology, then we should be seeing a decline in the litigiousness in this area. And we're absolutely not seeing that. Litigation is increasing in this area, not decreasing. So it seems like, as a learning process for this community, we're doing a pretty bad job because the disputes are on the upswing, not on the downswing. So I'm afraid that I'm not that optimistic. I think that you know, what I'd like to argue for is really a change, an addition to the criteria for patents to be acceptable, and that is very simply clear borders. So it ought to be that a legitimate dispute among experts about whether a product infringes on a patent should be treated as evidence that there is a problem with the patent. It is not today by the courts treated as evidence that there is a problem with the patent.
All right. So that's the end of the questioning, and now you both get 2 minutes to sum up, and under the rules of the debate, Edward, you're first.
All right. So I think I'm going to just highlight some of the points that I've already made. In my opinion, property laws are very useful, and they are necessary for proper conduct of business, and they're necessary for our economy. But property laws don't work if boundaries are unclear, because then enormous resources get wasted over needless disputes over those boundaries. I have been involved in fairly few patent cases, serving as an expert witness, and one of the things that I noted was that the lawyers who worked on these cases were, in my opinion, absolutely brilliant people. These were extremely smart, very hardworking people. I would give anything to have these guys as graduate students getting PhDs in my program. And in fact, I tried to convince some of them to dump what they were doing, and they asked me how much they would get paid. And they laughed at me when I told them. So you know, unfortunately, you know, in effect, what these people are doing is not always as productive as what those same brilliant minds could be doing if they were actually working on something more productive than needless disputes over boundaries that should have been clearer in the first place. If we want to encourage innovation, we need to invest in education. That's the way to encourage innovation, is invest in education. Unfortunately, the California voters don't seem to agree with me, but in my opinion, that is what we should be doing. I think that the goal of the patent system should not be directly to encourage innovation. It should be to maximize the impact of that innovation. So it should be to make sure that innovation has an effect, a positive effect on our culture, on our economy, and I think that it can do that. And it does do that in some industries. It does not do that in our industry. It fails abysmally to do that. Thank you very much.
Bob.
So first I'd like to say that it would be interesting to have a debate or a discussion about education. I suspect that Professor Lee and I would not be on opposite sides for that one. I think that education is really important, and I think for a number of reasons we are failing our students and our young people. But I think that's not the only part that fuels innovation. There's a lot of pieces to that puzzle, and I believe that patenting is just one of them. I want to mention that in preparing for this debate and writing my book, I do a lot of research on patents, and I decided I wanted some examples of patents, and I looked up paper clips. I wanted to show that simple things could be patented. I found hundreds of patents on paper clips. I don't know if anybody 100 and some years ago had a debate on whether there were too many paperclip patents or that there's no innovation on paper clips. But then also when I looked into things like movie cameras, my wife and I went to the Museum of Moving Images in Queens, New York last week, and they talked about the patent fights over moving images, projectors, where the bulb was located, what kind of mechanism for moving the film. And I think if you look at the history of patents, you'll see that yes, there is a rise in software patent litigation, but there is a huge rise, and I had some charts, I didn't bring them, I apologize, that shows, of course, in the early 1960s, there were no software engineers, or very few. The number of software engineers in the world, the number of IT people, the number of companies using software has just exploded. So of course, you would expect to see a similar rise in litigation. Well, I think, I'd like to end by saying that I thank you all for coming here, and I think this was a great debate. I think it's very necessary. I'm glad that you came to get both sides. I think that patents have worked for 221 years since Thomas Jefferson created the U.S. Patent Office for a nation that has more innovation, more prosperity, and more influence on engineering science than any other in the entire world. I'd like to say that no system is perfect. There will always be inefficiencies, loopholes, and inefficiencies. There will be those who take advantage of the system that we put in place, but I think we must continually work to make the system better, less fallible, more fair, rather than destroy the system that has worked for so long that has allowed our country's most creative people to prosper, and in turn allowed our entire society to prosper. Thank you.
All right. Okay, Edward and Bob, I'll ask you to just take a seat over there. I'm going to come back up to the stage. So first of all, please join me in thanking both of them for the energy and the participation today. I think you made this a great success, a great kickoff event. It's always fun to experiment, and you guys did a great job. So now we're going to do that second show of hands. Let me just remind you the count before: 175 people in the room, 64, 89 against, 26 undecided. We're going to ask for another show of hands now. Everyone who is for the motion that software patents encourage innovation, please raise your hands. We're going to go through the room and take a quick count. Now we had 203 people, which is 28 more than we had, so thanks for all of you who came after we got started. 70 are for the motion, 112 against the motion, 42 undecided. So with that count, under the rules of the debate, the motion fails, but that's certainly no reflection on Bob, and it's wonderful to have had both of you here to debate this. Thanks, guys, very, very much. Thank you for coming, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.